Do you think people can see into the future, Tom? Like average humans? Well, I guess if they can see into the future, they're not that average. But do you believe in that?
Well, if we can see into the past, we can see into the future.
Ooh, deep.
Yeah.
That doesn't quite track because the past has been documented and the future, as far as we know, has not.
Do you believe in seeing into the future, Emily?
I believe that human intuition is not fully understood and that, we can get some pretty good vibes about things to come, even if we can't see with much clarity. And, with the help of, a good set of tarot cards, or maybe it's a bit of palm reading, crystal ball, some soft lighting, and a Ouija board. A Ouija board's about the past, isn't it? But, tool of choice, I say.
Right, okay. If you can see into the future, Emily, riddle me this. Will producer Ben keep this part in the edit?
I don't need to see in the future to know that, because I know Ben very well, and the answer is no, he will not. But he does love a tarot card.
He loves a tarot card, and for that reason, maybe this will stay in.
Maybe he will. Maybe he will.
Please, Ben, keep it in.
Hello, Tom Praviti.
Hello, Emily Swaddle. Hello, listeners.
Welcome back to the Carbon Removal Show, and to this, the final instalment of our 3-part policy deep dive.
The final one. Yes, Carbon Removal Policy Part 3. It's been a bit of a marathon, I would say. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, a deep dive and a marathon. If you throw in a bicycle, we've done a whole triathlon.
If it's a triathlon that includes a marathon, that sounds more like a Ironman to me.
Gosh, we're such athletes.
Yeah.
If you're still with us on this policy journey, thank you. And congratulations on your athleticism. If you're just jumping in here for the final leg, you might need some more context before you cross the finish line and get all the glory. So take yourself back to the beginning. You can do this. We have faith in you.
It has taken some stamina to get to this point, but I'd say it's been worth it. We've learnt a heck of a lot along this journey. Last episode, we explored the big policy initiatives from the UN, EU and US federal level, some of them at least.
Yes, we spoke about all those letters and more, and the various ways in which their political moves are helping the CDR industry to scale up.
Yeah, at the end of last episode, I, for one, was certainly left feeling like we're in a major period of transition for this industry and for the policy that'll underpin and help scale it. It's all pretty exciting, but honestly, I would say at the same time, a little daunting when the stakes are this high.
Yeah, you said it, TP. There's a lot on the line here. Like the future of the planet and whether or not it's habitable. Not to mention the lives, livelihoods and habitats that are affected along the way. No pressure.
Yeah, pressure's for tyres. Anyway, you're right. There is no doubt that CDR is stepping into the policy limelight.
Yeah, we're playing with the big kids now.
But I think this episode is going to offer us a little ray of hope. Because today we're looking to the future. What might it hold and who's shaping it?
Bringing hope to the masses. Oh, we really are doing Mother Nature's work here, Tom. But on our road to hope, we must inevitably pass through uncertainty. Emily Swaddle, 2025.
Deep that.
Yeah, well, I just think it's true. While there is a lot of optimism that much needed CDR policy reform is coming, we are not the only ones feeling the pressure. People have been telling us that there is still a lot of uncertainty.
We wanted to know, what does it feel like to build the future when the rules don't yet exist?
Standard Gas Technologies is the developer of a mixed waste processing technology, deriving synthesis gas, which is like a natural gas replacement, and also carbon dioxide removals through its biochar element. Yeah, it's been around in its current form since 2014. It had a pilot plant in 2016. We're now currently commercialising a first commercial plant in Norfolk in the UK, which is looking to process about 48,000 tonnes of mixed waste a year, generating up to a maximum of around 20,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide removals and about 4 million therms of energy.
That was Oliver Gregono, carbon manager at Standard Gas Technologies, one of our wonderful coalition members.
Standard Gas Technologies has developed a new way of dealing with both biogenic and fossil-derived waste. Their technology processes different kinds of waste and transforms it into either a clean biogas or syngas and biochar, which inevitably captures and removes some carbon. Using waste to generate energy is nothing new, but Standard Gas's solution doesn't involve burning the waste, so the process is cleaner than the incinerator plants that you might have seen or heard of.
Our interest in the UK and EU policy on carbon dioxide removals was born out of the fact that we had a new technology that hadn't really been accepted by the wider CDR market. And what that means is that there wasn't an established methodology to account for the carbon dioxide removals that we were generating. Although it was similar to traditional homogeneous biochar projects, there's some further complexities due to the nature of the waste that we're processing.
If you're making biochar or doing another biomass-based form of CDR in a similar way to dozens of other companies, that's one thing. But if you're trying to innovate a climate solution that doesn't fit neatly into existing buckets, that's tricky for a load of other reasons. You may face unique challenges that other similar but not exactly aligned solutions don't have to deal with.
For Standard Gas Technologies, carbon removal isn't the only product of their business, but the ability to sell this product, to ensure that it'll be recognised as such in a way that's valuable to their customers, and to ensure that they can do all of this at a viable price, it will be an integral piece of their model.
We're monitoring policies to just make sure that they weren't encouraging incumbency, and so that space would be made available for new technologies that would come around so that they could have an equal opportunity at addressing the emissions that we're trying to remove. And so the first we saw of that was in the EU through the CRCF, which was beginning to take a view on what would be regarded as a carbon dioxide removal. And that has then developed to inform what will be accepted within the EU ETS. Now that's important because, of course, until a few years ago, the EU and the UK ETS were the same thing. And there'll be a decision to be made at a governmental level as to what GGRs look like within those frameworks. And so on the back of that, we've seen these both governments sort of requests for feedback on how the ETS will integrate GGRs. And for us, we want to know whether or not our carbon dioxide removal credits will be an appropriate fit for the ETS, both within the UK and the EU, and also whether or not we'll be able to trade across those borders.
What would that unlock for Standard Gas if the UK ETS deemed the technology that you're building would be applicable?
So the first thing is that at the moment, the voluntary carbon market commands a good price for carbon dioxide removal credits associated with technologies similar to ours. And so if we're looking to the future, we want to know that by being integrated in the ETS, it doesn't affect, that stream of revenue that we've got through the commitment of the purchase of our carbon removal credits. Now, we'd love to be a part of an organisation's journey to decarbonise what they're doing within the ETS, but we need to make sure that we can appropriately monetise that climate service to ensure that our business models stand up. And so what will need to happen is that the framework for which carbon removals, or GGRs, within the ETS are rewarded is there needs to be make up that price discrepancy between the current ETS UK allowance and what we're seeing on the voluntary carbon market. But fundamentally, we also, because we're processing fossil wastes like plastic and upgrading them into a usable fuel, which in itself displaces virgin fossil fuels, particularly natural gas, that is exciting for us because sitting within the ETS at the moment, there isn't a framework to reward that climate service, but we hope that's something that will come online and we can begin to decarbonise our partners' energies and work within the ETS.
We've talked over the past couple of episodes about what we need in order to make an effective political and economic landscape for all types of CDR. And I honestly think we also need the likes of Oliver and Standard Gas. It's an essential reminder that we'll always be innovating. Things will rarely fit perfectly into these designated boxes, and policy needs to be able to accommodate that and also encourage it.
Yeah, it is undoubtedly a difficult path with a load of uncertainty. The good news, of course, is that CDR companies do not have to forge this path alone. Nicholas Volgemuth from Carbon Future, another of our coalition members, highlighted one way in which they can have their voices heard.
There are different bodies or companies which are really taking action here. If you now look at biochar concretely, there is European Biochar, the former European Biochar Industry Consortium. They actually are very active in the policy making, and I think that such industry associations would also need to be formed probably for other types of removal. And I think only if these projects and players are well represented in the policy making, then also appropriate decisions can be made or supported, which would then consider the needs of the removal projects. And we have seen this with the carbon removal and carbon farming framework, that this was pretty much closed system, or proposed as a closed system for BECCS and DACs only, and only through the involvement of biochar industry and others. The proposed text now is open for also other types of removal. There's no concrete mentioning of biochar as far as I know, but it's at least open for other types of removal and similar activities as well, which then of course would help also to make it open for innovation, because we're here in a novel field. Ideas are around, and we need to also see that the policies do not actually rule out the one or the other activity before they even get market ready.
We know that the CDR industry's perspective is vital in this conversation, no doubt. But there is something that I would just like to acknowledge. When I think of industry lobbying, I can't say it brings an entirely rosy picture to mind. You know, it makes me think of big oil, big pharma, big tobacco.
Friends of the show.
Yeah, I bet they actually listen.
Do write in if you're listening from those offices. We'd love to hear from you.
But do you know what I mean, Tom? Like, industry lobbying doesn't have a great name for itself.
No, you're right. And it sort of brings to mind, giant, powerful organisations pushing for deregulation to boost their bottom line.
Exactly.
But for an emerging industry that's unlikely to be fully understood by many of the policymakers actually crafting this legislation, it feels really key that expert voices are heard, and that the experiences and knowledge of those on the front lines of these developing technologies are an integral part of the process.
Yeah, totally. That makes sense for sure.
We had a conversation with Chris Sherwood, Elizabeth Harding, and Lambrini Margheriti from the Negative Emissions Platform, another coalition member, about interacting with policymakers that really underline that point.
There are a number of frustrations, but I would say one of the biggest is this continuing lack of understanding of what carbon dioxide removals are, a confusion with various forms of emissions reductions, and arguments like, but why would you remove CO2 from the atmosphere when it's so much easier to remove it from the chimney of an emitter company?
Yeah, I would agree. I think the terminology is a really critical one. We often get conflated with CCS and CCU. Sometimes when we go to policymakers and we first ask, okay, so how much do you know about carbon removals? And then they go on like a 2-minute rant about how well they support CCS and everything. And so then we have to spend the next 5 to 10 minutes explaining why it's not the same as CCS. So we have a role to play in really educating policymakers so that they can find opportunities also to add sort of references to carbon removal and not just assume that it's included if CCS is mentioned in a piece of legislation.
I just wanted to add on to that, like another frustrating thing is when we engage with policymakers, and I feel like most of the times they acknowledge that carbon removals will be needed, but it is something that they only talk about, well, in the future, in the long-term future. They always use the word prioritize, like for now we have to prioritize emissions reductions, and then removals will need to happen after. And they just believe that this industry, the CDR industry, will miraculously build itself up as we get closer to 2050 and the climate neutrality target. So I think many times we need to emphasize that these things need to happen simultaneously. Obviously, we need to reduce emissions drastically, but we also have to start building up the CDR industry.
It's kind of mad to think that the confusions and misperceptions that we faced when we were first making season 1 of this show are still showing up at the highest levels of policy.
Yeah, policymakers need to go back to season 1. We always say it, start from the beginning. We got you. We got you. Come when you're ready.
Yeah, grab a cup of tea, tune in, thank us later.
Honestly, I'm not really surprised that there's still confusion on the basics, though.
Talk me through that.
Yeah, I mean, when I come across people in the wild who ask what I do, I'm always having to explain the concept of CDR, like from the beginning, from the basics. What it is, what it looks like, what it does, and then obviously plug the carbon removal show.
Of course. I think, to be fair, I probably find that's the case as well. I do have to start from the beginning a lot of the time when I'm explaining this stuff. Like, it is still niche.
Yeah, and I imagine a lot of our listeners who also work in this space can relate to that.
Totally. In this landscape of little understanding, Chris explained to us why the negative emissions platform was formed and what it does.
NEP was originally conceived as a Brussels-focused advocacy organization, and that continues to be our kind of core business. But I would say that members have expected us to do more, and so we've engaged more and more on the national level. A number of national governments within and without the EU that we've engaged with and tried to help with providing information about what CDR is, what their potential might be, connecting them with their own CDR industries in many cases, and also at the international level. There is no international global structure for the CDR industry, and so we're trying to step in and fill some of those gaps where the SBTi or where the UNFCCC publishes a consultation. At the moment, it's just every industry association providing a response. And so we're seeking to bring a little bit of architecture into the system and create coordination and build if you like, a global structure for the industry that will make our voice more powerful and taken more seriously by these kinds of international institutions.
It's clear that we need that coordination when it comes to answering public consultations and wider CDR education. And bodies like the Negative Emissions Platform, or NEP, can really pull resources and expertise to do this, particularly in an industry where so many companies are startups, and many of which just do not have anybody dedicated to policy in their team.
Something I found fascinating, though, that Chris highlighted, is the varying forms and methods that policy advocacy may have to take in order to respond to different geographies and different political norms.
One thing I've learned over a 25-year policy career is that government is done very differently in different parts of the world. And particularly when you are trying to represent and communicate a commercial industry interest to a government, they will typically have very different ways that they like to get that message. One easy example is that many governments prefer to hear from a collective rather than an individual company. That's certainly the case in Europe. So getting together in a trade association or an industry group like ours is a very useful way of getting your voice heard, because otherwise they'll feel suspicious or worried that they're going to be captured by a single interest, etc. But governments around the world may be suspicious of industry associations. So I know that in some countries in the Middle East, for example, they're literally not allowed, and government will prefer to have a dialogue with industry on its own terms, where it creates a meeting and invites certain players to the room, and then a discussion happens. In some countries, industry associations are viewed with suspicion, and instead they prefer to talk to universities and academics. In others, it's think tanks. In others, it's law firms. And so industry that wants to interact with a particular government needs to understand the local advocacy culture and adapt and organize and behave accordingly.
Beyond the outward-facing work of policy advocacy, there's also work to be done on aligning the industry in terms of standards and values. And NEP has responded with their CDR industry commitments, a set of commitments around things like transparency, MRV, and sustainability. And we're happy to say that the Carbon Removal Show is a proud signatory of these commitments.
The CDR Industry Commitments is a document that was developed by the Negative Emissions Platform's members, but it's not restricted to the members for signature. And indeed, we have almost 120 signatory organizations already. It's an ethical standard for the sector, which is designed to bring structure and discipline to the sector and to help it kind of mature. We are a collection of startups, essentially today in most cases, and we really need to convert this ecosystem into something approaching a proper industry because we need to mature and grow very quickly. The commitments have three primary functions, I would say. So first of all, it's to provide inspiration for and to channel the energies of people who are coming into CDR, entrepreneurs, people in accelerators and incubators. This is one way to help you align with the CDR community. It's secondly, potentially a tool for discipline. So in time, as pressures increase and companies want to push the boundaries, hopefully, the CDR industry commitments will provide a measure by which society can keep us accountable. And thirdly, the CDR industry commitments should be a useful tool for us to interact with other stakeholder communities, such as NGOs, the media, governments, and to increase our credibility outside of our own echo chamber.
In part, this is a recognition that a lot of the policy framework this industry is going to need just isn't there yet. And so this acts as important tone setting, establishing good faith operating and helping to align the industry on a set of values that will ensure it works to support people and planet.
Right, setting us up for the future of the industry. On the subject of the future, I think we're nearing that point in this miniseries where we really need to start looking ahead and ask, what does the future hold? And what other levers do we all have to help shape it when it comes to CDR policy?
I'm sensing the re-emergence of Emily's crystal ball here.
It's more the tarot cards I'm relying on these days. We'll see how we go. I'll let you introduce this next section.
I'd love to see your tarot reading for carbon removal. We'll do that another time. While coalitions like NEP are pushing hard to get carbon removals written into the law, there's another set of actors shaping the future of CDR without passing a single bill. These are the voluntary frameworks.
Right. And when we started researching and planning for this mini-series, I have to say I did ask myself if we should really be talking about these on episodes about policy, because when you think of policy, you think of something mandatory. But of course, when it comes to the world of CDR, a whole ecosystem of voluntary frameworks has emerged to fill the gaps that policy hasn't yet grown to fill. I mean, we have a whole voluntary carbon market with groups like rating agencies, registries, and more setting all the terms. They're kind of the de facto rule makers in this moment.
And the one big one that we wanted to look at was the SBTi, or Science Based Targets Initiative. Here's Robert Höglund.
The Science Based Target Initiative started in 2015 by a group of different organizations like World Resource Institute and WWF. It's the leading corporate target standard setter, and they validate corporate targets that are set according to their frameworks. Up until a few years ago, this was only for near-term targets, and it is science-based in the sense that they look at what is needed to reach the 1.5 target. For example, how quickly would corporate emissions need to reduce in different sectors, and it's always tied back to science. That has some subjectivity in it, of course, as well, because you may need to have different guidance for different sectors, but as far as it goes, it's science-based. And in 2021, they introduced a net zero standard, and companies could set net zero targets as well.
Stats from the SBTi themselves indicate that over 10,500 companies have set or have committed to setting science-based targets. Incredibly, back in 2023, companies with such targets or commitments represented 39% of the global economy by market capitalization. And that number will have grown since then. That's bigger than any single country.
Crikey, that is a big number.
Yeah, it's huge. I mean, it's worth noting that not all of those companies have actually set a net zero target, but you can think of them as being on the pathway to doing so, all being well. So the potential impact of the guidance that the SBTi sets is enormous.
Robert actually served on the SBTi's technical advisory group, which is external to the SBTi itself. So he was speaking in a personal capacity, but he laid out how he saw the initiative's influence in recent years.
It's been very instrumental in getting companies to set net zero targets and raise their ambitions. It sort of set some kind of baseline of this is what you should be doing if you're a big company, and it definitely persuaded a lot of companies to act that probably otherwise wouldn't have. So I think it had a huge positive influence. And there's nothing really close to it in influence. It wouldn't be replaced immediately by something else, at least. So when it comes to national legislation, that's not really fit for purpose for these multinational companies, because their emissions are spread all over the place anyway. And I don't think it comes natural to decision makers to regulate what companies would do outside of normal, like legislation where you tax fossil fuels and so on. So I do think that these kind of voluntary initiatives and the SBTi really holds the pole position is going to continue to be important.
So how do removals fit into all of this?
Well, for the most ambitious companies, they will have set a net zero compliant pathway for 2050 or before, and the near-term priority here will be on reducing emissions. The previous version of the standards stated that after a company has achieved its long-term target and cut emissions by more than 90%, it must use permanent carbon removal and storage to counterbalance the final 10% or more of residual emissions that cannot be eliminated. So, there's been recognition of the role of CDR here for some time.
Right, this is obviously important recognition of the role of CDR in reaching net zero, but doesn't it kick the can down the road? I mean, for this industry to scale, we need removals to be financed well before most companies have reached 90% emissions reductions.
Exactly, and that's been a bone of contention. When we spoke to Robert, we were still waiting for the SBTi to publish its new draft corporate net zero standard, and expectations were high that there would be significant updates concerning the integration of carbon removal. Well, this draft guidance was published in March, and it didn't quite live up to the hopes of many people that we've been speaking to.
This is draft guidance though, right? So is all hope lost here?
No, not quite. There's currently a consultation out as we speak, and it certainly wasn't all bad news. On the plus side, the draft presented 3 options for how interim carbon removal targets might be introduced. It also underscored the importance of initiating carbon removal efforts in the near term, rather than deferring action until the net zero target year.
That is what we need to help scale the CDR industry in line with climate science.
However, the draft drew criticism from the CDR community for not making interim CDR targets mandatory, and for restricting the use of CDR to just Scope 1 emissions.
A reminder for listeners, Scope 1 emissions are the direct greenhouse gas emissions that a company generates from sources it owns or controls, like fuel combustion or the powering of a liquid fuel vehicle fleet. Obviously, this will vary massively by business and sector, but in many cases, we're really talking about a tiny portion of most companies' emissions.
Exactly. And this approach might be reasonable if all companies had science-based targets. As they say, your Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions are somebody else's Scope 1. But this is particularly important because heavy Scope 1 emitters, such as those in steel, cement, aviation, oil and gas, are underrepresented among SBTi signatories. So even though a big chunk of the world's economy by market cap is covered by this guidance, the portion of global Scope 1 emissions covered is much smaller.
So what are we making of all this, Tom?
Well, one key point is engagement. The SBTi's consultation is something that a lot in the space are responding to or planning to. And though we may not get what we want in this instance, this kind of engagement is key to keeping the conversation going. But I think it's also a lesson that sometimes we shouldn't just focus on the big policy with a capital P when we're talking about policy, because the potential impact of something like the SBTi is at least as big as some of the government-led initiatives that we've been speaking about.
I agree, Tom. I agree. And voluntary frameworks are filling a vacuum, for sure. But so far, they aren't giving the demand boost that CDR needs to scale. And even if they did, we know just how possible it is for voluntary corporate commitments to backslide, particularly when times get tough or the political dial shifts. So I wonder what else we can look to give us a bit of optimism. Where's that hope that you promised me, Tom? Bring it.
As we've said before, CDR isn't just going to be happening in the so-called global north. Last episode, we spent a lot of time looking at what's going on in the EU and the US, because this is where a lot of CDR and CDR policy has been happening so far. But we're thinking about the future. We're going to want to expand our scope just a little bit.
Indeed. As we know, the term Global South can be unhelpful. There's no fixed definition. Some find it has historically problematic echoes, and it's kind of a catch-all term that encompasses hugely diverse cultures and geographies, representing the significant majority of the planet's people and land. Super helpful, thank you. But when we're thinking about the future of this industry, it's still kind of a useful framing in some ways, because it draws our attention to the vast potential outside of the more developed markets of the US, the EU, and other economically developed countries.
And that potential is already beginning to be realised. I want to give a shout out to CDR.FYI, as we often do on this pod, who have a map cataloguing CDR companies worldwide. And yes, while you can see many in North America and in Europe, there are also pockets of activity all over the world. Sub-Saharan Africa, particularly East Africa, India, Southeast Asia, and South America, particularly Brazil.
Yeah, it's such a great resource, and one I actually hadn't spotted until recently, so thanks, Tom. The truth is, while CDR has been slower to get off the ground in much of the global south, for many, this is where much of the future lies. Here's Opna's Shilpka Gautam, who we heard from briefly at the end of the last episode.
The global south in particular, or emerging markets, the tropics, however you want to sort of call them, they have immense natural resources, they have immense talent, they have immense capacity for innovation, and they have the biggest capacity to create outsized outcomes for people, whether that's financial inclusion, whether that's socioeconomic uplift, whether that's biodiversity uplift. And I'm so glad to see that, some of the biggest and the boldest and the most impactful projects in carbon removal, both the nature-based, no doubt, because, you can't really have massive reforestation projects like the kinds you can have in Brazil in many parts of the world. But projects, for example, in biochar, from the work that Exomat Green is doing in Bolivia, to projects like Carboneers that are in Ghana and in India, to projects like MASH Makes. The other thing that's really cool is if you look at some of the DAC projects like Octavia Carbon and the work that folks are doing just by and large in Kenya, there are not many better places to do DAC than Kenya. I think 93% of the greatest green, great geological storage. So besides the fact, all the things I said around impact and talent, density and innovation, there's just the really right places to be doing carbon removals.
Much of this won't be new to our listeners, but the pace of this has really been quite incredible. I remember sitting at conferences a couple of years ago where people would mention that we should all maybe be considering the global south, but it was usually more as an afterthought, and they always told the same few stories or highlighted the same couple of companies. But so much has happened in such a short time.
And what really strikes me about Shilp's framing is this view that not only are some of these countries good places to be doing biochar, reforestation, or DAC, they're actually the places where this scale can be realised.
Yeah, totally. Not to mention the significant potential justice angle here that I think we've spoken about before, and all the potential co-benefits to some of these projects.
Absolutely. But, as Shilp's explained to us, there's still a perception among some founders or investors that there are risks of engaging in these markets.
A couple of months ago, we hosted a CDR breakfast in London at our headquarters. And we had an incredible array of people, banks, asset managers, insurance companies, some of the leading CDR developers in the world. And we asked one of the companies, they're a DAC company, hey, you've proven out your tech, in lab phase. If you had the choice, why don't you go to Kenya? You've got the grid, you've got geological storage, all this is right. And what they said was, it's still hard to manage sometimes the right or sometimes the perceived risk of whether it's political or expropriation or other risks or Article 6 risk of emerging markets. And if it's so hard already to build a CDR project, and if you're not from that geography, you may not be the best person to go build that company in that geography. All that to say, the global south are rather emerging markets because no two countries are the same. The funding landscape in Kenya looks very different from Brazil, looks very different from India, looks very different from the Philippines. The funding landscape has always been challenging. If you were raising capital from a bank in the US or the UK, because it doesn't really matter that you're in the first instance that you're raising money for carbon removal, because you always encounter emerging markets risk.
Yeah, I mean, risk is obviously something that founders and investors have to contend with in all contexts. It's important to note that projects anywhere in the world face these, and recent events have shown us that political winds can change no matter where you are. But I can see why a less developed policy framework or a less certain political picture can add to these concerns.
On top of this, compared to many countries in the global north, particularly the US, which has historically been all about those financial incentives, as we've seen, projects in the global south are much less likely to be able to access direct financial support from governments that can typically reduce the financial risk.
By and large, the projects in the global south that are operational have no such privilege, simply because the funding landscape in emerging markets has been challenging, continues to be challenging. So folks have needed to be really smart and really innovative and really just resourceful in how they raise capital, how they deploy it, how they achieve operational efficiency, and how they scale. So in terms of the independence and scale of these projects, more than ever, it's really exciting what's happening. And I'm sitting in India right now. I've had the opportunity to visit a number of our partners. I'm going out to see more. And, we have a term in Hindi. It's called jugaad. And jugaad just means resourcefulness. And the jugaad that people are doing in order to just get stuff done, it's exciting.
Loving that optimism and just get stuff done mentality. Fantastic.
Yeah, I guess the flip side of less direct support can be greater resourcefulness and entrepreneurship. And those projects that do emerge are going to have really proven themselves to some degree.
Yes, it is true. But part of me also feels that it shouldn't have to be like this. I mean, we recognise that these projects are offering vital solutions to a global problem. To get an understanding of how policy might play a role here, we spoke with Omaloro Mishak from CAPE, Climate Action Platform Africa, about the policy landscape that they encounter and the work that they're doing.
At CAPE, we like to paint a picture, and that picture is just imagine a future where Africa's economic growth doesn't come at the planet's expense. A future where our growth actually comes by healing the planet, where we restore forests, we scale carbon markets, we help build green industries, and in all of that, providing better economic security. When you think about Africa and you think about climates, you just think about all the different ways that the continent has been affected. However, the goal is to change that narrative, is to recognize the opportunities, the resources that Africa has, and how we can leverage the fact that Africa has strong renewable energy potential, that Africa has land and natural assets. I think about 65% of all of the unused arable land in the world is in Africa. We also have a very young population. About 60% of African inhabitants are below 25. So when you put all of these factors together, you see that we have such a strong role that we can play in terms of helping the world meet its climate goals. And we can do this in a way that benefits the continent, that benefits the people. And at CAPE, our work is focused on driving that narrative, on showing that Africa can grow, not by copying old models, but by creating new ones. And we do this with evidence, we build evidence, we support policy advocacy, and we also provide practical supports that help grow this narrative of climate positive growth.
As Omaloro told us, the policy context in different countries CAPE works across obviously varies massively, but she wanted to share the work happening in Zambia as an example of how some countries in the region are working to build a more robust policy framework that could eventually support the development of CDR projects.
Zambia provides a very good picture of what's possible, right? When you look at the African landscape in terms of carbon markets, you see different countries at different stages of their journey. You find countries that are more nascent in terms of their growth. You find countries that are emerging in how they're thinking about carbon markets, and you find countries that are super progressive. I'd say that Zambia is in the middle, where it's an emerging country, and in the way typical of emerging countries, you see that the government understands what is required. You see that increasingly capacity gaps are being closed up. And so, because of that understanding, there's action that follows through with it. They currently have their climate change bill, which was released early this year. They also have a carbon market framework that was released in 2022 that clearly states what the processes should be. They also then have the first act that they had was the Forest Management Act, which was created with the intention of regulating REDD+ projects. And so you find that the regulations are inclined towards such projects. Now, the main work being done is looking at the climate change bill and looking at how appropriate it is for Zambia, identifying what gaps exist, also identifying conflicts, I guess, between both of the acts, and just saying, for example, where one has a specific regulation and how things should go versus another one that prescribes something else, and trying to bring those two together to ensure that when project developers or any other key stakeholder looks to the regulation, they can see a key or a clear pathway to follow that creates that level of trust that is required before going into a country.
Super interesting. And you can really feel the impact that getting this right is going to have.
Yeah, totally. A lot of it comes down to that risk perception piece that Shilps mentioned earlier. Where policy is lacking, there are all sorts of concerns, many valid, about the integrity of projects and their long-term viability.
Yeah, and when we talk about carbon projects in Africa, for the most part, we haven't been talking about carbon removal historically. And just like elsewhere, some of these projects haven't always been the most high quality or transparent. So, as we're thinking about laying the groundwork for this new generation of CDR projects, I imagine there's a lot that can be learned from and built upon when it comes to developing and drafting this policy.
60% of the projects, of carbon projects in Africa, are either REDD+ projects or cook stove projects. And when you go from a country to country level, you find that in some cases it's as high as 86% of REDD+ projects, sometimes 75%. And policies follow the trend of demand. Even within Africa, like with the rest of the world, you find that there are more policies in that area because that's just where the demand is today. But also it's recognizing that African countries and African leaders are more and more open because, again, when you think about proof of concepts, they've developed policies, regulations for REDD+ projects and seen the impact on their countries. They've extended those to cover other types of projects. Alternatively, I'd also say that more rounded regulations or carbon market frameworks, once they start developing carbon market frameworks, then those are usually applicable to removal projects. And usually it's also then a case of where there are gaps in the regulations, then that's then the role of stakeholder engagements, the collaboration to highlight how that this is an area that is currently not covered. But today, in the trend that we see for most African countries, we see them moving more from a focus on just REDD+ projects to trying to align their policies to what Article 6 has set out.
One final thing I wanted to share here from our conversation with Omoloro was around benefit sharing. Beyond getting that basic policy infrastructure in place to help build trust and create pathways for the establishment of these projects, there's also important work happening on the ground to ensure that they deliver the other benefits we've spoken about.
The social benefits and the development opportunities.
Yes, exactly, and that they can happen fairly and equitably.
Benefit sharing is thinking about and recognizing that those carbon revenues were earned based on projects undertaken in host communities or via the help of communities. So it's recognizing that some part of that revenue should be shared with the communities that helped you achieve them. For Zambia, we had a workshop where we came up with pathways for meeting the identified gaps and touching on the recommendations we had proposed. And interestingly, one of those that we had come up with was the need for a benefit sharing guideline, because at the moment you had an act that mentioned the need for benefit sharing frameworks to be submitted, but there was no clear indication on what those were supposed to contain. And so our proposal was the need to develop that, and that is still currently in draft format, but we developed it looking at international standards and also considering Zambia's specific context. And while the core details of the guidelines again is still in draft and with the government, the core principles they were built on was equity, transparency, accountability, and enforcement. Generally, with everything in Africa, you find that there is no one size fits all rule. So again, even with benefit sharing, you find that coming into play where you can't have prescriptive guidelines, but what we came up with were based on those core principles.
We are nearing the end of our mammoth policy journey, Emily.
I really hate goodbyes. I don't want to get emotional, Tom. Not that I'm saying goodbye to you, you understand. We're just saying goodbye to our policy journey.
Well, try just to hold it in for a few more minutes if you can, because we're not quite there yet.
Are my emotions not welcome here?
They'll be welcome in 5 minutes' time. There was one final big theme that emerged from our conversations that felt very timely and important when we're thinking about the levers that we have over the coming years to drive policy action on CDR. And that is the sub-national level.
Nothing to do with submarines, I assume.
No.
So we started right at the top of the pyramid with the UN. So I guess it's only right that we end here, at the grassroots. That's a bit of a mix of metaphors, but I think you get the picture.
This topic has been particularly hot at the moment because of the current situation in the US. With a stalling of CDR and other climate policy action at the federal level, attention is turning to what can be done over the next few years, and many are understandably looking to the state level and even city level for that leadership and progress.
And obviously the power of subnational policy to drive change is going to vary considerably by country. Some are super centralised, others less so. But in the US at least, the states and cities do, for now, have quite a bit of power and influence when it comes to supporting the growth of CDR. The Open Air Collective's Chris Nidal, who we heard from earlier in the series, gave us some more insight.
Four Corners is really a collaboration of Open Air and Boulder County, Colorado, Flagstaff, Arizona started it, but then there's a number of other municipalities and counties in the Southwest, and now it's expanding to other parts of the country. You know, the normal progression is that you have, let's say, a DAC company or a BEX company or a, biochar company, and they need to go and knock on the door of the local place and say, hey, can we do this? We want to flip that where you have enough understanding and interest at the local level where they solicit it, but they solicit it on their own terms. And so for Four Corners, we've given out these catalytic grants for first-of-kind projects within those Four Corners states out west. But we do it with a theme that's decided by our local government partners that do it jointly. So the first one was CDR and concrete. And we picked that because it's the part of the country that has the fastest rates of growth in the real estate market. A lot of construction is happening in these places, but it's also an industry that's inherently local. All concrete is really produced locally because of the material. And so that, for people who were encountering CDR for the first time, they could see the endorsement of their local government, but then it also immediately hooking it onto something that just doesn't make it something abstract, but you're plugging it into something that people literally encounter every second of the day, which is concrete. And then we did a second round of that, which was CDR plus liability biomass, which just means biomaterials that fuel forest fires, which is the most emotional and urgent sort of concern in these parts of the country, where you get places like Boulder that almost got wiped out by a forest fire a couple of years ago. And if you can link that you can do CDR, but at the same time it has these significant co-benefits of minimizing the risk of forest fire, that really, really resonates with people. And that becomes their frame of reference for what we're talking about, rather than a graph in the IPCC or some spooky rendering of a giant metal facility that, creeps people out, And so that's what you can do on the local. And it doesn't stay local because we live in a world where you're creating these moments that hopefully will get picked up and, will live more digitally. Well, people will hear about it everywhere, once you start doing it. Those policies are valuable in their own right when they're implemented at the state, but it starts to create these points of reference for the federal government. The federal government is often looked to California and New York and other places, and that inspires regulation at that level. We don't expect a receptive audience, certainly for the next 4 years, but we hope that if you get a critical mass of states to start to implement that, then you get into a position where you might be able to propose something like that in the federal government. And there's a very long history of that kind of dynamic in not just climate tech, but in all areas of policy.
There's some super cool examples there. And I think just a great illustration of how more local level initiatives can drive change.
Yeah, and I think something I've found quite striking is that these are the levels where advocacy can often be more rapidly and effectively applied. We all know that legislatures for countries like the US can both be super slow moving and highly vulnerable to the ups and downs of electoral cycles. But as Chris said, state or city level politics can often be more stable, and getting things on the agenda can be a little easier, maybe just a smidge or a tad, a little tiny bit easier, maybe.
States also in general have a lot more continuity and local governments do, where you don't have these crazy 100-degree swings between different political ideologies and priorities. They tend to be in place for much longer. We call them red and blue states and purple states. So you can start to think a little bit more long term about commitments in ways that you can't at the federal level. And the same applies at the local level as well. The higher up in government, you need a certain kind of capacity to even be in the conversation. Where the lower you are, it's way more retail. And most of the bills, Open Air is not a formal organization. It has no funding. We passed 6 laws related to carbon removal at the state level all around the country with zero budget. And it's fueled by getting people in who normally would never be considered for a professional role in climate policy doing the work. You know what I mean? And so I think that's the part too, this has to be something that is deeply entrenched and absorbed among the public at large. So I would say that way too, is that we can't be too sort of precious and rarefied when we think about who should be in the conversation, because we're not going to be able to lift this with just the usual suspects.
Tom, I know you have worked with your local council a bit in your work with Restored. How have you found all that?
I'd never considered myself somebody that's really remotely involved in policy. It's not something that I was interested in. It's not something that I felt like I had much of a say in. Yeah, I didn't feel like I had much to contribute to. And I certainly didn't really consider policy being a big part of the work that we have at Restored, my biochar company in the UK. However, actually having done this policy mini-series, I've reflected on the work that we've done over the last 18 months, and a huge part of it has been driving to sort of bring biochar up the local agenda. And, subsequently that's led to me having many conversations with Cornwall Council and other policymakers in the area, and really just sort of bringing that awareness to be front and centre. And I've seen that actually a big part of my job is grassroots, subtle sort of policy development. But I guess my reflection is that we all have agency. We all can drive policy change, particularly at a local level.
Do you know, I think that's really nice. Like, it kind of, dare I say, gives me a little bit of hope in democracy. That you, as a business owner and a constituent, feel that you can have a bit of a say in how your local area deals with and approaches this thing that you care a lot about. Yeah, that's restored a bit of hope for me. So I guess we've come full circle in this episode, Tom. Thank you.
You're very welcome. I'm glad that we've restored some of that hope for you. Pardon the pun.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. Still got it. It's just taken me by surprise, actually, how open people can be to these topics. If you get in the right room and you're able to, grab somebody's ear and talk a little bit about this area, then generally people are curious. And so I would say if people are advocating for this type of industry for carbon removal, then they shouldn't be afraid to get into those conversations, get into those rooms and really beeline for people that they feel may have influence.
As we come to the end here, I just want to share some closing words from Christoph Beutler that I think really help to remind us of some of the things we're trying to achieve and really what is at stake.
If you were to go back to 2015, knowing what you know now, in that early phase of understanding this, what would you say differently, do differently, suggest differently?
Honestly, I guess not much, because if you zoom out further, we've known about climate since the 70s. It's been a big political kind of debate in the 1980s. In the late 80s, we almost got to a point where countries would agree on emissions reductions. We didn't make that. I think what we have achieved in the period of, 2015 to 2022 is the most we have ever achieved, right? All of the net zero goals, a lot of higher carbon prices in the EU ETS, all of that falls into that period. So arguably it is the most successful period in climate policy ever by a big margin. The problem is only that this needs to be sustained, and currently we're not seeing that. We need to follow through with the goals, right? So how do you follow through with a goal? You have a net zero goal enshrined in law, so now you need to break it down. You need a 2040 goal. So we get that most likely on the reduction side. That will be a 90% reduction. That's already amazing, right? But what we're not seeing is the corresponding ramp or scale up pathway or the CDR goal of, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5%. And if we have that, then you need to put money behind that in a smart way, so you get to those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5% and to net zero in 2050. And I think this is what is being interrupted at the moment, or slowed down, so to speak. So goals are one thing, but the policies that allow the goals to be achieved is the other thing. And that's, I think, where we're struggling a bit more.
What's the biggest frustration that you have with the CDR industry?
I guess it's not a frustration with the CDR industry. I think that because CDR started not as a business opportunity, but as a scientific concept, it's an outcome of the climate models, right? The brief is neutralize 10 or more percent, probably 25% of the world's emissions. And this is written into a lot of goals, like net zero goals. And we're doing a really, really big effort, I guess, in some parts of the world to arrive at comprehensive policy. My biggest frustration, I would say, is that this whole field is just backed by VC money. So if we really follow through with the size of what this industry needs to contribute, and we know that, right, from the models, we need to get different kind of finances into the system, and that needs to be politically mandated. And I think my biggest frustration is where we are at the moment, that the good run was too short for now. And I think everybody's kind of now trying to scramble and rethink. Obviously, with every day that passes, the task falling on CDR is getting bigger. I really hope we don't end up in this world. I really hope we understand as a species, we are the only species that can see and plan into the future. And I really do hope that we make use of this, because otherwise it's going to be a much less stable future from an economic perspective. And I'm sure we will find a way. My question is, how much time will we lose on the way?
We made it.
Across the finish line.
You can release those emotions now, Emily.
Oh, thank goodness. Do you know, Tom, over the course of making this mini-series, we have conducted about 15 hours of recorded interviews and many more off-mic conversations.
Goodness me.
That's a lot. That's a lot for 3 episodes.
I mean, that's a lot of calendars to navigate.
Oh, yeah. And of course, we couldn't share anywhere near all of what we captured. But, now that we have dipped our toe into the policy waters, I feel that it's definitely something we'll feel confident coming back to in future. Wouldn't you agree, Tom?
I would say this actually has been one of the most eye-opening parts of my time on the carbon removal show.
Mm.
In the last 4.5 years, obviously, we've gone from knowing nothing about carbon removal to knowing a fair bit. Policy's always been that gap for me, and I feel as though I've really sort of leveled up my confidence in this space. And I hope that people that have listened to the 3-parter alongside us feel the same way.
Yeah, I can certainly relate to that. I think ultimately it's left me with this sense of the complexity of the problem before us. You know, there are so many levels, there are so many actors, but it's also highlighted the possibility, what we can actually achieve, what can actually be done here. I think the importance of all this just becomes more and more clear to me with every episode we make, and particularly with something like policy. Yeah, it's kind of inspired me a bit to go and see if there's anyone in my local area that I can speak to about what's happening in CDR where I live, you know?
Chances are there may be something happening. If there are some actions that people can take from this, I would say, firstly, if you're at that high level and listening to this, you know, from a position of policy making, then really do take stock and consider what has been in the last 3 episodes. Really do consider the role of carbon removal in our climate and net zero strategies, because it's integral. And if it's not part of it, or if it's not on the agenda, then it really feels like there's some pause for consideration that needs to be had. At the same time, if you're working, let's say, in the carbon removal space, but do not have a policy title, there is nothing stopping you from being involved. Just like the experience that I've had from Restored, there is so much that you can get stuck into, whether it's having conversations with local policymakers or people in your constituency, or even providing feedback on consultations. Policy making is not done in a suit, in a smart, swanky building. It's done all over the place. It's in most of the conversations that we have at this point in time, at this stage of the industry.
And if there's one thing we can certainly all do, it's vote.
Voting is important. So we're going to be taking our newfound policy nerding knowledge and considering it as we produce new episodes.
We've already had some really great feedback and interactions from the 2 policy episodes we've released. So we would love to keep that going. Let us know what you think about this whole mini-series, about this episode in particular. Get in touch via LinkedIn, email, info@thecarbonremovalshow.com. We'd love to hear from you.
We will be back with more episodes later in the year. For now, we're going to be on a break, a summer break.
Thank you so much to everyone who's contributed to this mini-series. And thank you to you, listeners, for sticking with us.
Thank you for listening to The Carbon Removal Show.
Please subscribe if you haven't already and follow us. We're on LinkedIn, Instagram, Threads. It helps so much.
And if you could do me this one favour, share this podcast with a friend or a colleague who might resonate with this episode.
A huge thank you to all our coalition members, without whom the Carbon Removal Show would not be possible.
B0, Carbon Engineering, Carbon Gap, Carbon Future,
ClimeFi, Ivotama, Klarna, Mashmakes,
Milky Wire, Negative Emissions Platform, Opna,
Patch, Pinwheel, Plan Boo, Recarber,
Sebastian Manhart, Standard Gas Technologies, Supercritical, and Offstream.
If you or your company are interested in joining this amazing coalition, please get in touch.
The Carbon Removal Show is hosted by me, Tom Praviti.
And me, Emily Swaddle.
And produced by me, Ben Weaver-Hinks.